am a staff developer, instructional facilitator for Broward County Public Schools. I work in the elementary learning department, which means I assist teachers and schools with trainings, I write curriculum, etc. And I am blessed enough to have a partnership with the Equity and Diversity Department. So I've been training almost 2 years now for them. And one of my passions is the African American history, past and present. And we're going to see very briefly, this is kind of just excerpts of what we do during the school year, which is a larger training. And last summer I ran it for a week as well. So we're just going to give you a little taste of it. And as you can see on the front screen, there is an Adinkra symbol. This is Sankofa, which is translated to mean go back to the past and bring forward that which is useful. And that's what I hope to bring to you this afternoon. Is useful information of important African-American people that have contributed to not only United States history, but the world. Okay. All right. So with that, just real quick, if you can, in the chat, just compile a list of African-American persons or African descent people who have made contributions to society that you might know offhand. And do not include any entertainers, athletes, or Malcolm, Martin, and Rosa. Okay, and if you could do that, go ahead and quickly put that in the chat box for me. Yes, yes, finally. First VP female as well. Yep, Marcus Garvey, good. Yes, Nelson Mandela, President Obama, Maya, Booker, very good, very good. D.A. Dorsey, Ruby Bridges, of course, Frederick Douglass, yes, yes, been to his house. Fabulous, fabulous. Ooh, Toussaint Louverture, yay! That's my other course I teach actually for equity, which is Haitian heritage. And we just came out with a new one this year called Haitian culture. So yes, very much so. Okay, Stacey Abrams. Yes, she was pivotal this last go round, this last election. Very good. So with that, there are a lot of names. Some are more famous than others. And one of the reasons why I didn't want you to share Malcolm, Martin, or Rosa is because in elementary school, those seem to be the three names that are taught year after year after year after year as we go through all the grades and the children matriculate from kindergarten all the way through fifth grade. They're always being taught the same characters or the same people in history, and we don't usually go outside that time period. And when you really think about Martin or Malcolm or Rosa, it's always that civil rights period. So we're going to dive a little deeper in why we have to go beyond that. So the very first thing is here in Florida, we are very lucky. We are one of the states that does have state statute telling us that we must teach students the African American history, the history of African people before political conflicts that led to the development of slavery. So prior to slavery, the passage to America, the enslavement experience, abolition, and contributions. So whether you're teaching kindergarten or 12th grade, we all know we have social studies standards that we might include this information, but we don't always go beyond our social studies standards. And so hopefully today you'll see why it's so important to go beyond, because a lot of us, even in kindergarten, you're reading Anansi stories, right? The little spider, the tricky spider, you usually use it to teach theme or the message in stories because they are fables. So they have a very strong and explicit lesson it teaches. However, if you're teaching Anansi and you're not talking about the great kingdom of Ghana in Africa, that's where Anansi started and how it's been an oral tradition brought over with the enslaved, you're missing a piece of history and you're really not teaching all to the depth you can. And even in kindergarten, you don't have to go into a whole big spiel, but you can definitely tell them that this is from the great kingdom of Ghana, etc., and then read your story. So there's many, many reasons why we do that. So there was a Stetson University professor, Dr. Patrick Coggins, which you can see at the bottom. I've cited him. He is part of the Commissioner of Education's African American History Task Force in Florida. And what we've learned through that process is that teaching African American history is actually teaching American history. I mean, we've all heard about Lewis and Clark, and we know fifth grade teaches that. But if you're not talking about York during that experience, you're missing pieces of American history that lends itself to that African American voice. So we know it is teaching history. We also know that research shows teaching African American history does several things for students, all students in the classroom. It enhances the self-esteem of African Americans and all children. It increases students' academic performance, and it increases the positive perception of African descent and African Americans as a group in American society, the world, and especially here where I'm from in Broward County. Now, if you want more information about that task force, they did come up with some lesson plans. They kind of curtailed it by grade. So we have K through 3 lesson plans, or K through 2 lesson plans, 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12, all found within this website. My PowerPoints are hyperlinked, so if you click on that blue, it will take you to the website. Anyway, in this task force document from the Commissioner of Education, it gives you an overview of the big ideas and then lesson grades, again, by grade level. Now, based on this report is how we have designed the training that we currently do, and that is in these 7 areas. This is what we like to focus in on, and this is what I'm going to briefly go over today, are these 7 areas. Ancient Africa, which means pre-Columbus. Before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, we're talking about what was happening in Africa. We have African exploration of the world, again, pre-Columbus. We have invasioning and the weakening of Africa when the Europeans started to colonize the continent. We have slavery, which is post-Columbus in Americas. We have neo-slavery, which encompasses all areas, including abolition, civil rights, and the constitutional rights. And then we have the soul of African Americans, which is a much broader term. Here we can bring in many, many contributions, especially when it comes to the arts. And then we have a section where it is just contributions of the world in US. So these are the different types of areas of curriculum that I'm going to quickly cover today, briefly, just give you a little taste of it. And then if you join us during the school year in Broward County, we offer this course again. We go in depth in these 7 areas. Okay, so with that being said, let's just take a quick pulse of, if we look at the 7 topics, these 7 topics, and you are asked to teach something to your current grade level or your neighbor or your child or your niece or nephew, if you had to discuss all 7 of these areas, could you find something to contribute from your knowledge in all 7 areas to that other person, even if it's a colleague? So kind of just share an emoji in the chat box for me of how you would feel about being asked to do all 7 different areas. And if you don't know how to do the emojis, just drop in the feeling. Okay. Happy, nervous. Yeah, it is a lot. Yes, Tina, it is. Okay, some people feel comfortable, excited. All right. Yes, so it's going to be interesting for those of you who are saying a little nervous, because if you didn't have really good history being taught to you, there are pieces that you might not be as comfortable. You may feel more comfortable on contributions or even the soul, but if we're talking pre-Columbus, not everyone is comfortable with that history. So very good. I see I have a nice mix, right? Excited, wanting to do it as well. So thank you. Comfortable, love history. Me too, always. Okay, so with that, again, I'm trying to watch my timing, right? We're going to look a little bit at the ancient Africa pre-Columbus and ancient African exploration of the world prior to Columbus. Now, today's focus is not so much the history, but people who have contributed to our knowledge. So one of the first things I want to definitely show you is someone who has totally redefined our knowledge of the world prior to Columbus. Okay, so the very first thing you see is a book. It's on the left side of your screen. This book is called They Came Before Columbus. And this is a very detailed documentation of the presence and legacy of Africans in ancient America. It examines their navigation skills, their shipbuilding, cultural analogies between Native Americans and Africans, the transportation of plants and animals and textiles between the continents. Again, all of this before Christopher Columbus. And this also includes actual diaries, journals, and oral accounts from the explorers themselves. So there, Christopher Columbus is quoted in this book, etc. So the author is the picture you see on your screen. He is Ivan van Sertima. Now, he is really important when it comes to this work because he was actually a pioneer in linguistics and then anthropology, and has appeared in numerous scholarly journals. He was a professor, and I said was because he's no longer with us, but he was a professor who taught African American studies at Rutgers University. And not only is this a very detailed account of evidence that Africans sailed and explored prior to Christopher Columbus. So if you think about what you were taught, or at least my age group was taught, we were taught that everyone in the world thought the world was flat, and it wasn't, if it wasn't for Christopher Columbus, we never would have found other parts of the world, because he was the one brave enough to see, think that the world was not flat. So what is interesting about this work, and what Van Sertima does in this text, is really shows that prior to Columbus and the Europeans really exploring, we had the Africans. So in Mexico, there is a culture called the Olmecs, right? And that has African descents, and so he goes in depth in that area as well. Now, what else is interesting, and if you didn't hear what I just said about Christopher Columbus, it's probably because of Van Sertima's work. In 1987, he actually appeared before Congress to discuss Christopher Columbus's Quincentenary Jubilee Act, where he single-handedly really presented enough evidence to Congress to prove that Africans made contacts with the Native Americans long before Christopher Columbus did, and that he didn't discover us, he was an explorer. So that is why we're seeing a difference in what is being taught now to what was being taught many, many years ago. Right? So these are some of the contributions that Van Sertima did. Okay. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the invasion and weakening of Africa, European colonization, because there's some huge, huge pieces here for us as well. So with that, a lot of us don't know when and where it happened. We know of the Middle Passage, which was like a 300-year span of time. And so everyone assumes that was happening. We were importing the enslaved to the Americas for 300 years, etc. So there was portions of that. We had some coastal. So when we think of the continent of Africa, we did have some coastal colonization of Portugal and some other European countries, but it wasn't overly populated. And it wasn't until the late 1880s did we see this mass explosion of colonization of the continent. And that was really primarily due to November 15th, 1884. And that was when the Berlin Conference took place. So the Berlin Conference was a meeting between European powers and the United States, and it actually divided up Africa into a very fair and civilized way. Meaning the nations sat around a table, right, and had this conference deciding who was going to get what piece of Africa. And the problem is that no one from Africa was invited nor involved in any of the dividing of the native lands. So here we have outsiders sitting around a table with a map saying, I'm going to take this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece. And this is what happened. And we see this mass explosion of the whole continent being divided between the European countries and the United States. And what was really interesting is that the agreements that were made were all based on trade, and it really followed the rivers. And so there was free trade along the Niger and the Congo River, but before the conference and after the conference, only about 10% of Africa, was left uncolonized. So let me just back up a step. So about 10% of Africa was colonized prior to the Berlin Conference. And when it was done, there was only 10% left that wasn't colonized. So we see this huge, huge piece. Now, when we talk about African Americans who really contributed to history, we have someone called George Washington Williams. Some of you might know his name now because he was the background for one of the lead characters in the last Tarzan movie. And he actually was a real person. He was born a son of a laborer. He then enlisted when he turned 14 years old in the Union Army and fought in the Civil War. He then was served as a representative in the Ohio State House, right, for Ohio. He published a very unbiased, relatively objective account of what happened in America, and it's called The History of the Negro Race in America from 1619 to 1880. And then he also went to visit the Congo in 1890 and was shocked at what Belgium's president, right, Leopold, was doing at the time in the Congo. And he actually wrote an open letter, published it, went to Britain. He campaigned to stop the brutality that he witnessed. And that was really where we see the beginnings of, from Europeans, taking limbs for not producing enough work, etc. We know it's still a practice now, but this is really where we saw it introduced by the Europeans. Okay, so this is actually a picture of George Washington Williams. Okay. So the next piece is slavery post-Columbus. This is probably the most uncomfortable for teachers. Teachers do not always want to teach slavery, especially if they are white. It's very uncomfortable for them. They feel uncomfortable discussing it with African-American children. And so there's a great article by NPR that kind of covers the big rocks of why teachers are afraid. And there's great lessons in a, it used to be called teaching tolerance, and now it's justice. And it's on part of the syllabus that they've uploaded for you. So with that being said, we're going to talk a little bit about someone who really helped us better understand the enslaved, the process, the travel across the seas. And this is actually Rhodesia. She was a child when the slave traders chained her to their boat. She was kidnapped at the age of 12 in what we call, in what now is considered Benin. She became a prisoner on Clotilda. Clotilda is the last known slave ship to smuggle people or the enslaved into the United States. And so she actually lived all the way up until 72 years. So she was part of the whole Civil War. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. So she lived all the way up until the Civil War. So as a scholar in the United Kingdom, she documented her, and she lived all the way until 1937. So right before, the civil rights movement really started to gain a lot of speed here in the United States. So her name, her enslaved name was Sally Smith, but she lived 72 years after slavery's abolition, or abolishment. So she is one of the big figures. A lot of people don't know about her or teach about her, but gave us a lot of information on that travel. She was the last living enslaved person that was actually not born here, but brought over. Okay. All right. All right, our next piece is neo-slavery. So abolitionist, civil and constitutional rights. Today, we're gonna focus a little bit more on the abolitionists because there's a lot of misinformation when it comes to abolitionists. The first thing I could suggest when you're getting into a conversation with anyone about this is always looking at the root. Students don't always understand this piece because it's abolish. Just taking it down to the root, taking the affix off helps a little bit more. Their mission was to abolish. Most people are taught that abolitionists wanted to help the enslaved or African Americans, and that was their sole purpose, to make them free, when that's not really an accurate description of the movement. The movement was more about saving the slave owners, the owner of the property, because they felt if they continued down that pathway, they would not be able to be redeemed in God's light, right? And they would spend eternity in hell. So that was the main thought. And so a lot of times it's taught incorrectly. I know when I was taught growing up, these were white people up north who wanted to save the Black people. That's not really what it was. So with that being said, there's lots of those that we're trying to help. However, for this course, I want to focus on those who were either born here or were brought over as enslaved. And so there's three people I want to talk about that were all enslaved. We have Frederick Douglass is the first picture. Most of you have heard his name. He is extremely famous. He was an escaped slave who became a very prominent activist, author, public speaker. He became one of the leaders in the abolitionist movement. And this is where it starts to change from where it started, the movement, to where it ended up. He sought to end the practice of slavery before and during the Civil War. He had a relationship with Lincoln. We know that through letters and documentations. And so much so that Mary Todd actually gifted Lincoln's walking cane to Frederick Douglass after his assassination. And what's interesting, if you've ever get a chance to go to his home, one thing about himself, he always never want to forget his enslavement period of his life, that so much so that the actual ties on his curtains are handcuffs. So he would remember that he came from that process. Harriet Tubman is the next. She is very famous. Lots and lots of people talk about her. She is probably one of the most taught characters when it comes to slavery and the enslaved in school. She was an escaped slave who became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And interesting enough, most kids think is actually a train that runs under the ground. And now that I think it was Netflix came out with that, was it Netflix or Prime? One of them had a series called Underground Railroad, that it was a train. That's going to even cause more confusion. So anyway, make sure you clarify that it wasn't actually a train under the ground. So she led many slaves to freedom before the Civil War, and carrying a bounty on her head. She was also a nurse and a Union spy. And then, just like many other leaders of the abolitionist movement, they all kind of transitioned into women's suffrage as well. So she was a women's suffrage supporter. Yes, Ramona, it was not at all what I thought. I thought it would be something historical. It was not my favorite, but I did suffer through it all, and it was on Prime. Thank you for clarifying. All right, Sojourner Truth. I love this woman. She was an African-American evangelist. She was an abolitionist. She was a women's rights activist and an author. She did not have a wonderful life. She really suffered as an enslaved. She served many masters throughout New York before escaping to her freedom in 1826. In 1851, she was speaking at the National Women's Convention in Ohio when she said, "Ain't I a woman?" Right? So that is one of her famous speeches, and I highly recommend having your students read through that speech, or at least listening to them. National Archives is a great place to get either recordings or primary sources. All right, so these are just three. My time is limited and I want to get to Q&A. So with that being said, we're going to move to the soul of African Americans. In this topic or this arena, we usually talk about myths, resources, values, and one of my favorites is the Harlem Renaissance, because so much has happened during that time period. So the Harlem Renaissance was the name given to a huge cultural and social and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem, New York. And it started right around the end of World War I and went all the way through the middle of the 1930s. That was like that big rush. It continued after, but the big rush was really during that time period. Some people call that time period not just the Harlem Renaissance, they call it the New Negro Movement, and that was named after 1925 anthology written by Alan Locke. So amid this period, Harlem really became the Mecca, right? It was where most of the Black writers, artists, musicians, photographers, poets, and scholars really traveled to find a place where they felt they could express their talents freely. It was a big think tank area. And one of the factors contributing to that rise, right, in the Harlem Renaissance was part of another migration, right, which is the Great Migration. That's what it's called here in the United States. And it was the Great Migration of African Americans to the northern cities from the southern states. Around 1919 to 1926. And further. So we had the Harlem Renaissance, which is the big explosion. And then we had that continued movement all the way through the 1970s. And during that time period, so from 1916 to 1970, it is estimated that approximately 6 million African American Southerners relocated to the urban areas up in the North and the West. So with that, there's a great website that if you click on the picture on your screen, it should take you to, and if not, it's cited on my syllabus as well. But this is a great website for the Harlem Renaissance, because you can look at not only the writers, the jazz musicians, but the artists as well. And if you are from Florida, there is a native-born artist during this time period. Her name is Augusta Savage. And so she was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and she's a Florida native. So if I have anyone who teaches fourth grade, for sure, this is someone you can focus on as well, because it falls within your social studies and African American. Now, why do I focus on Harlem Renaissance and jazz music? Because jazz truly is a United States genre, right? So it is part of the early part of the 20th century. It was started down in the South, right near New Orleans, near the mouth of the Mississippi. It definitely has influences from the city's population there, where it was more diverse than almost anywhere else in the South. You had people of African descent, French. You had the French from when it was owned by French, part of that Louisiana Purchase. You had Caribbean, Italians, Germans, Mexicans, and the indigenous of the United States, which some people call American Indians. And they very much interacted with each other. And what they did is they took what they had from their individual cultures and they merged it and mixed it with traditional African American traditions. And we start to see it gradually emerge from a blend of ragtime and marches and blues and other kinds of music. And at first, jazz truly was just for dancing. However, once the first recording of jazz around 1970 was published, it spread wildly and rapidly, and it has the evolution of many of the brilliant musicians we know and love: Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, etc. So what you see on your screen is the very famous Art Kane jazz portrait in 1958. And what Art Kane did, he realized that this is a dying generation, those who started jazz. So he put a call out to all the musicians: hey, we're going to meet at this block at this time. Come to get in the photo. And so this is what you see. This is who was still around, who was able to get there. I love the neighborhood kids sitting in the very front row. And if you look at his series, and you can look at Art Kane's jazz photos online, or again in this website, they show who showed up late. There's a couple artists who showed up late, so they weren't in this photo, and they have other photos of them as well. So again, great resource if you're talking about jazz, the Harlem Renaissance, and the soul of African music. Okay, so the next piece is contributions. So when you think of contributions to the world and the US, I want you to think in a broad area or arena. I want you to think about art, literature, music, politics, science, religion, medicine, and other areas. Okay, so we're going to kind of look at a few today, not all of them. Okay, the first is this great website. Again, it's hyperlinked on your screen, or you can just Google it, blackinventor.com. And so what you'll see here are a group of inventors. And what is interesting about inventions is we know we have a patent process. So when we think of who have been very innovative as a culture, as a I can't think the word, I'm sorry guys, it just escaped me. But if we think of a nationality who has totally been on the forefront of innovations, we have to really look at those who have been largely ignored by society. So we have Black inventors who were either born or forced into American slavery. And even though if you read the US patent law, it was absolutely created with a very colorblind language, right? Because they wanted to foster innovation. However, the patent system consistently excluded these inventors from recognition. So when you look at the amount of inventions that are traced back to people born in the United States, we have about 87% of those inventions that are, again, people from the United States. And out of that 87%, 2.7 of the US total were invented by Black Americans or African Americans, which is the largest share than any other immigrant group. So I want you to think about that, how creative and what a percentage that is, because I know we talk about peanuts, right? We talk about certain inventors, but we haven't really dug into in depth a lot of names that have been granted patents. So this is a great website. Plus it makes it interdisciplinary because you can do it during a science time period. Here are some other contributors that have contributed not only here in the United States, but across the world. We have influences in architects, we have arts and government. And again, we have innovators and pioneers. Not all of these are inventors, but these, you know, some of these people have been in politics, and some of these people, yes, have been inventors. They might be speakers, but there are many, many more names that we can really dive into with not only our students, but for ourselves. Most of us, when we think about the civil rights movement, we think of a handful of names, and we don't really know everyone who is behind the scenes. So that is one of the things, hopefully today's presentation really encouraged you, is to try to dive a little deeper in depth to actual historical events. I could go through, anytime you're talking about history, I could go through many events that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for either African or African Americans contributing. All the way, I made reference a little earlier to the Lewis and Clark expedition, but we can talk about even getting Louisiana Purchase. How did that happen? Why did we get it for so cheap? What is the background story? And we know that is directly tied to what happened with the Haitian, the country of Haiti, right? So they had a huge influence, even in the Revolutionary War. A lot of you may or may not know, there is a very famous statue, but it has multiple people, and there's a little drummer boy in Savannah, Georgia, and it's the Battle of Savannah. And that is attributed to those free men from Haiti that came and fought. And what a lot of people don't know, when they're in Georgia looking at that statue, thinking about the American Revolution, is that little drummer boy will grow up to be one of the presidents of Haiti. So he came here as a drummer boy, learned tools, tricks, saw military responses, and then went back and applied it when he was in his home country. So there's lots of combinations. There's a lot of support, George Washington's secret deals, etc. So we kind of have to just go outside the realm of what we think we know, and those same names, Martin, Malcolm, you know, Ruby, etc. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm open up for questions. So we have a Q&A time. I'm going to try to scroll back a little bit through our notes to see what else. Maybe I missed something, but feel free to put a note in the box or a question.
What's best is if you put it in a Q&A, for sure, Sharon can see it. So if you put it in the Q&A, it doesn't get hidden. So anybody have any questions? I will look at some of the chats for you, Sharon, to see if you have any questions from the chats. Okay. You know, somebody asked, what's her name? And that was, I don't know when that was you were talking about. I don't know when that was. Maybe somebody said Zorna Hurston. I don't know. I'm gonna be honest. Fantastic history story, but nobody has given us any questions. We have some comments here. Oh. Anyone, any questions at all? Who was the person that, oh, here's one. Here we go. How will CRT response impact our ability to teach historical truths?
So that is such an interesting question. So I think where it really comes down to is the bias piece, making sure you are staying true. So I'm just going to go back to when I talked a little bit about the Berlin Conference. I know when I was a 5th grade teacher in the classroom and we had textbooks, Broward doesn't have textbooks right now for their adoption, but when we did, there was a very small, when I say about this big, blurb about the Berlin Conference. And we didn't have it, you know, if you didn't have the background knowledge as the educator in the room, you wouldn't have been able to go into depth. And it didn't seem like it was a big important piece of history because it was so small in context to the rest of the story it was teaching us. So we always have to keep in mind that where does our textbook and our history that we're currently teaching come from? And we have to think about the system we use, and that is traditionally a very European mindset. We teach history through a European viewpoint. So with the critical theory, response theory that we just got a bill about, it's all about teaching biases. So if you stick to the history, the true stories, the facts, you should be okay. You should be okay. It's just trying to make sure, teaching it through that bias piece, saying that, you know, all white people or something, or just stay away from the alls, right? Like, and let them form their own opinion. When you're teaching, you know, anything that's uncomfortable, especially when we're talking about the enslavement process, it's uncomfortable no matter what color you are teaching to, whatever color students you have. It doesn't matter, because it's a tough topic. It's not comfortable for anyone. So you have to present all sides. And one of the experiences I had, if you guys ever get the chance, was Colonial Williamsburg. When I went to Colonial Williamsburg on a grant, I went for a week, and every single day we were there, we took on a different role. There was a day that we were those who we learned navigate. One day we were the indigenous. We learned how to skin a hide. The next day we were a navigator on a ship. So we learned those skills. The next day we were a cook in, you know, for a wealthy family. The very next day we were the governor's wife, right? Learning dances. Another day we were the enslaved, and they took us out to the fields and we learned how to pick cotton, and we went inside, you know, where the enslaved lived. Because you have to bring in all vantage points and viewpoints, I think that you let people, you let your students really bridge that gap.
All right, we have another question, I think, here. How do you get these facts and people into the state adopted textbooks?
So that's interesting. That is one thing Broward County, I think we're on the forefront of. When we went through the adoption process last time, we could not find a quality textbook that encompasses enough of these stories. We didn't find it to be enough of it to be unbiased, right? So that's why we chose in our county not to go with the textbook, but to give you a collection of text, so we could find more stories that brought out other viewpoints and avenues for you. So we opened it up. Plus we gave you DBQs, which is nothing but looking at primary sources and making those sources available for you to create your own understandings, right? That process, that critical thinking skill, right?
Okay. Probably have one more question you might be able to do, Sharon, before 1:45, because we'll have somebody else jumping in here.
Yes.
Who is your personal favorite African-American historical figure and why? And then they want to know where to get your presentation. It is hard for me
to say. It depends on the time period. I definitely have multiple. I am a huge fan of Frederick Douglass, and I think it's because the influences, right? So if you compare his speeches to that at the time period of Abraham Lincoln, you really understand the influence he had. Remember, he was the first enslaved person, first African-American person to be invited into the White House. I used to do a lot of comparisons with his speeches to that of Abraham Lincoln. So that he is one of my favorites.
Okay, so what time is it here? I think that you got 2 minutes, and they want to know, one person real quick, repeat your definition of the abolition movement, and then can they get your presentation, or you have any information, because I know you can upload some information to the app. So they want that question. We got 2 minutes.
So I submitted my syllabus, Ms. Hall, so I believe that was uploaded for me, correct?
Okay, well, yeah, that was for if you tell us to upload it, but that was actually, just to go to the committee. So if you want us to upload it, we will. So send me an email, tell me that, and we'll put it on the website.
Okay, so the syllabus has all the resources I shared with you today, it's already hyperlinked in my syllabus, and it has it by topic. So when
Okay.
I was talking about abolitionists, there's those websites I referenced, and I gave you a little extra. So that is a great resource for that. And remember, when you look at abolitionist, it's not so much that they wanted to save the African Americans or the enslaved. It was more about how they wanted to save the soul of the white person, right? The slave owner, the plantation owner. And so you can look at, there is a ton of information in the National Archives showing that. Look at the speeches, look at why, that's why a lot of them were people of the cloth, right, who got involved. Okay, it's 1:45. I would love to stay and take questions. Feel free to email me. My name is Sharon Hepburn. You see my name. So all you have to do is put @browardschools.com, and you can reach out to me through email. Everyone have a great day and happy Juneteenth.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm gonna stop the recording. I'm gonna stop the recording now.
Yes, I'm so excited. It's a national holiday now.